You wake to a silence where trust once lived, sensing the room still stands while the foundation beneath your feet has quietly dissolved overnight. The crisis did not knock or shout. It seeped through ledgers and promises, leaving you calm enough to mistake paralysis for stability. You remember saying relief would come later, like spring after winter, while your breath fogged in a house you swore was warm. Debt entered gently, a polite guest, removing its coat, smiling, sitting close enough that you stopped noticing how little space remained. Each borrowed moment felt harmless, like leaning on a wall, until the wall leaned back, whispering that balance was now your responsibility. You reassured yourself that control meant appearances, so you polished surfaces while rot spread silently through the beams you avoided inspecting. Numbers stopped behaving like tools and became moods rising and sinking, with your sleep shaping anxiety without ever explaining themselves. You began rationing honesty, telling citizens stories the way parents soften truths, believing delay was kindness rather than fear. The markets watched you blink first, sensing hesitation like blood in water, circling patiently without touching you yet. You promised protection without admitting cost, stacking vows like plates, hoping weight would not matter if nobody counted. Dependency grew familiar, a quiet reliance on strangers who smiled while measuring how much of you could be carved away. When revenue thinned, you flinched, realizing the cupboard was never full, only rearranged to look abundant under dim light. Taxes became an unspoken thought, hovering like a knife on the table, reflecting faces, pretending not to notice its edge. You delayed the cut, choosing numbness, because pain postponed feels lighter than pain owned, even as the bill accrues interest. The public sensed the lie before hearing it, feeling pressure change, ears popping as altitude dropped without warning. You told yourself survival required sacrifice, quietly deciding whose blood would thicken the ground enough to stand on. Trust cracked audibly, a sharp sound like ice splitting, followed by the slow dread of realizing everyone heard it. Raising taxes was no decision at all then, only gravity pulling weight downward when nothing else would hold. You framed it as necessity, not failure, yet your hands shook, knowing necessity is how helplessness introduces itself politely. Night fell without sirens, and you understood collapse can feel like routine, especially when tomorrow is taxed before it arrives. Morning returns heavier like a debt collector who knows your name, your habits, and exactly how long you have been pretending this balance was manageable. You scan reports, the way gamblers scan cards hunting for mercy, in patterns that never cared whether you believed in luck. Confidence drains slowly, not with panic, but with routine, as if fear has been promoted into a permanent administrative role. You notice how often you say temporary, using the word like a sedative, hoping repetition will dull its dishonesty. Foreign money waits patiently, arms crossed, smiling with the calm of someone who owns your house and lets you sleep there. You feel smaller inside your own borders, like a host overstaying in a room that once answered to your voice. Interest hums softly in the background, a mosquito you cannot swat, whining through every quiet moment of thought. The crisis is now a schedule, a calendar full of meetings where nothing is solved, only postponed with fresh signatures. You trade autonomy for time signing away tomorrow, in exchange for another calm afternoon today. Each concession feels minor, a single thread pulled loose, yet the fabric grows thinner around your shoulders. You sense resentment, rising like humidity, invisible but exhausting, clinging to skin, slowing every movement. People still work, still pay, still hope, and that endurance becomes the resource you exploit most. You tell yourself they can handle a little more because they always have, because they always must. Taxes re-enter the conversation quietly, not as policy, but as inevitability, like aging or gravity. You frame it as fairness, spreading weight evenly, ignoring how some backs are already bent into permanent shapes. The wealthy barely notice the change, stepping over it like a shallow puddle on their way inside. The rest feel it immediately, a tightening throat, a shorter breath at the register, a pause before spending. You call this resilience, mistaking tolerance for strength, mistaking exhaustion for loyalty. Dependency smiles again, closer now, hand on your shoulder, reminding you how much worse it could still become. And you understand taxes will rise, not because you choose them, but because you no longer recognize yourself without them. The days blur together now, each one stamped and approved before you fully wake, leaving you unsure when urgency quietly became your normal weather. You listen to advisors the way patients listen to doctors, who avoid eye contact, sensing bad news hidden behind professional calm. The ledger feels heavier than paper should. like it remembers every promise you pressed into it with shaking hands. You start to fear growth because growth attracts attention, and attention invites questions you cannot answer without bleeding credibility. Stability becomes a performance rehearsed daily, while backstage ropes fray and stage lights flicker without warning. You borrow language from hope, polishing words like recovery until they shine bright enough to blind even you. Citizens adapt faster than you expect, shrinking dreams quietly cutting corners inside their lives to make space for your decisions. Their adjustment feels like permission, and you take it mistaking survival instincts for endorsement. The system exhales tension. Through small failures, outages, delays, cracks, you label coincidences to keep the story intact. You sense patience thinning, not loudly, but with the dry sound of paper tearing one fiber at a time. Taxes edge upward again. Incremental, almost polite, like a stranger inching closer on an empty bus. You tell yourself gradual harm is gentler, even as cumulative weight begins to bow the strongest backs. The word fair returns often repeated until it loses shape. A coin rubbed smooth by too many nervous fingers. You notice how often fairness means arithmetic never faces, because faces would make the numbers accuse you. Quiet anger settles into kitchens and commutes an unspoken presence, riding along, listening, remembering. You hear it late at night, the low hum of discontent, like power lines under strain just before failure. Dependency now speaks without smiling, listing conditions, plainly reminding you who writes the fine print. You nod, because nodding costs nothing immediately, and immediate relief has become your primary currency. In the mirror, you barely recognize authority, seeing instead a caretaker rationing pain to extend the inevitable. And still taxes rise not as punishment, but as proof you are managing decline instead of preventing collapse. You stop marking time by years and start measuring it by thresholds, each one crossed quietly, each one promising things will not get worse. The economy feels like an old elevator, groaning between floors, forcing smiles, while everyone listens for the snap of cable. You grow fluent in delay, speaking it smoothly, confidently, until postponement feels like action rather than avoidance. Small successes are celebrated loudly, because silence would reveal how little ground they actually recover. You notice how emergencies now arrive pre-written, familiar scripts, where the ending always asks the same sacrifice. People brace instinctively, shoulders raised, wallets lighter, learning pain before you officially announce it. Taxes become background noise, like traffic outside a window you forgot how to close years ago. You stop asking whether it helps and start asking how much it can still take. Dependence reshapes language, turning requests into obligations, obligations into norms, norms into silence. You feel watched constantly, not by enemies, but by creditors who never blink and never sleep. Public trust thins again, stretched, transparent, showing every flaw you hoped distance would blur. You respond with gestures, symbolic trims, careful words that look decisive from far away. Inside, you know symbolism is anesthesia, not medicine numbing without healing. The middle class exhales slowly, a long breath that sounds like resignation, not relief. You convince yourself stability means endurance, not progress, because endurance is easier to sell. Another adjustment passes quietly through law, small enough to ignore, heavy enough to feel. You watch consumption slow, like a heartbeat weakening, steady but unmistakably fading. Fear stops spiking and settles, becoming furniture everyone learns to live around. You realize the system is no longer designed to grow, only to extract without screaming. And taxes rise again, not to fix the machine, but to keep it from admitting it is already broken. You wake knowing nothing dramatic will happen today. And that certainty frightens you more than panic ever did. The system survives on habit now, not strength moving forward, because stopping would expose how little fuel remains. You notice how obedience replaces belief payments made without conviction, like prayers recited after faith has left. Each tax notice lands softer than the last, not because it hurts less, but because nerves have gone dull. You call this adaptation, praising flexibility, while quietly relying on exhaustion to prevent resistance. Behind closed doors, plans shrink ambitions, folded smaller, each meeting tucked away like letters never sent. The future stops being a destination and becomes a liability you try not to look at directly. You hear laughter, sometimes sharp and brief, the sound people make when humor is the only safe protest left. Dependency no longer negotiates, it schedules, informing you when adjustments will occur. You comply automatically, muscle memory, replacing judgment, signature following signature. Taxes slide upward again, Barely announced, a quiet recalibration everyone feels in their spine. You justify it as maintenance, as upkeep, as the price of keeping lights on a little longer. But maintenance implies repair, and you know you are only slowing decay. The poor bend first, the middle strains next, and you tell yourself the order is unavoidable. Wealth floats above the waterline, dry and mobile, watching currents without urgency. You sense a hollowing, a feeling of being governed by inertia rather than intention. Responsibility becomes a costume you wear daily, heavy, familiar, impossible to remove. You speak of recovery less now because repetition has drained the word of even false comfort. Silence grows louder than protest, a thick, quiet settling after years of managed disappointment. And you understand, taxes keep rising because stillness is safer than change when courage has already been spent. You feel time compress now, weeks folding into days, decisions stacking faster than you can remember agreeing to them. The system no longer asks what is right, only what is survivable until the next sunrise. Advisors speak in softer voices as if volume itself might shatter what remains intact. You begin to envy past crises because at least they announce themselves with drama and clear edges. This one whispers constant and dull, eroding resolve, the way water reshapes stone without permission. Taxes rise again, small increments justified as alignment, calibration, balance, words that hide the cut. You sign with a steady hand, you do not feel, watching ink dry faster than doubt can catch up. The public adjusts automatically, now budgets rewritten before announcements finish broadcasting. Pain becomes predictable, and predictability feels falsely comforting. You confuse compliance with trust because both look quiet from behind a podium. Dependency sends reminders instead of threats, calendar invites instead of ultimatums. You accept them all because refusing would require a strength you no longer practice. The middle shrinks further, not disappearing, just thinning, until it can no longer support weight. Consumption slows to ritual purchases weighed emotionally before materially. You sense an economy holding its breath, afraid to exhale in case something collapses. Fear has matured into policy, unspoken but decisive, guiding every cautious move. Taxes become permanent features, fixtures bolted into the floor of daily life. You remember when they were temporary, and the memory feels almost naive. Accountability fades, replaced by process checklists, procedures that diffuse blame like fog. And you realize the rise never stops, because stopping would require admitting the crisis never ended. You stop expecting relief and begin managing expectations, lowering them carefully so disappointment lands softer. The language shifts again, taxes, renamed, contributions, adjustments, shared responsibility, anything but what they feel like. You notice how quickly new terms settle, how easily reality bends when words are applied often enough. The public absorbs it quietly, fatigue, smoothing outrage into acceptance. Dependency now feels domestic, like a mortgage you cannot move out of without losing everything. You measure success by absence of chaos, celebrating days when nothing explodes. In those quiet stretches, you sense how fragile the calm truly is. Another increase passes, slid into law between holidays, thin enough to hide behind decorations. You tell yourself timing is mercy. The middle tightens again, belts cinched until breathing becomes conscious effort. Wealth adapts instantly, shifting shapes, relocating, barely leaving footprints. You watch it go without calling after it. Fear no longer spikes. It plateaus, a constant elevation sickness nobody remembers choosing. You operate within limits set elsewhere, following rules written in rooms you never enter. Taxes become the lever you are allowed to pull, the only one still connected. You pull it gently, repeatedly, hoping gradual pressure avoids snapping. The crowd learns to flinch in advance, bracing before every announcement. You sense the trust reservoir nearly empty, its walls damp, cracking, echoing hollow. Still, you continue because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing wrong. And the rise continues, not out of cruelty, but out of habit learned during prolonged fear. You no longer announce increases as events, only as updates, folded into routine communications people skim while eating dinner. The system feels older now, joints stiff, movements cautious, surviving through careful repetition rather than strength. You watch citizens adapt their lives around the pressure. Smaller celebrations, delayed plans, quieter hopes. Each adjustment confirms your strategy works, even as it quietly erodes the reason it was meant to protect. Taxes stop feeling temporary and start feeling architectural pillars, holding ceilings that sag anyway. You begin designing around them, accepting their permanence as a law of gravity. Dependency speaks less often now, because obedience no longer requires reminders. You sense how deeply the pattern has set, like a scar tissue, that stiffens every future movement. The economy no longer limps. It walks with a cane, steady enough to move too fragile to run. You call this maturity. Public anger turns inward, self-directed, expressed through shame instead of protest. You benefit from that silence, even as it corrodes the social bond you rely on. Another rise passes with barely a headline, overshadowed by distractions you welcome. You tell yourself distraction is mercy too. Wealth has learned the rhythm, stepping lightly between beats, never absorbing the full impact. The burden settles lower, each time sinking toward those with least room to bend. You feel the system's pulse weaken, but it still ticks, and that is enough to justify continuation. Taxes become your metronome setting pace, preventing sudden collapse through constant pressure. You stop asking when it ends, and the rise persists, because persistence has replaced purpose as your guiding principle. You notice how memory shortens, how past rates feel normal now, how outrage expires faster than paperwork. The system teaches patience, the way captivity teaches calm through repetition and the removal of alternatives. You approve another increase without ceremony, barely pausing the motion practiced and emotionally hollow. It no longer feels like taking, but like maintaining pressure on a wound to keep it from bleeding out. Citizens budget instinctively now subtracting hope before numbers, assuming less before being told. You interpret this as stability, ignoring how it resembles surrender from a different angle. Dependency fades into the background, invisible but structural, like rebar hidden inside concrete. The language of crisis disappears, replaced by the language of management. You stop saying emergency and start saying baseline. Taxes lock into place as part of identity, no longer policy but environment. The young grow up inside it, never knowing the weight was once lighter. You envy their ignorance because memory is the heaviest tax you still carry. Another adjustment arrives, quietly buried in footnotes few will read. You rely on complexity now, trusting confusion to succeed where authority no longer can. Compliance flows smoothly, not forced, not chosen, simply expected. You sense resistance has not vanished, only gone dormant, sleeping beneath routine. The system tightens its grip gently, confident no sudden move is required. Taxes rise again almost imperceptibly, like temperature increasing in a sealed room. You feel heat but cannot name the source without naming yourself. And you continue because acknowledging the trap would require admitting you helped build it. At the end, nothing collapses outward, no alarms or flames, only a quiet settling, as if the structure finally accepts its own weight. You look back for the moment it could have changed, but history offers only a blur of reasonable steps and careful compromises. Each increase felt justified alone. A stitch to stop bleeding, until the stitches became the skin itself. You realize the crisis never demanded resolution, only accommodation, and you provided it faithfully. Taxes did not rise out of malice, but out of habit reinforced by fear and rewarded by temporary calm. What you lost was not money first, but imagination, the ability to picture a future without constant extraction. Citizens adapt completely, now shaping lives around limits they no longer question. You stand as custodian of a system that survives by narrowing, proud of its endurance, uneasy about its purpose. The real reason reveals itself without drama. When courage vanished, revenue became the substitute. And so, the rise ends nowhere, continuing forward, because endings require choices, and choices were the first thing you gave away.